Hello and welcome to Gaspar's History Podcast. This is Gaspar, and I'm continuing the Meat Hound series with episode 12, Bombs Away. Our story takes place in the latter part of March 1943 and originates in Thurley, England with the 306th Bombardment Group and the 423rd Bomb Squadron, with Lieutenant David Steele and his friends in our drama, which include Lieutenants Hamilton and Jones, Sergeants Bamforth, Hull, Stymax, Piotrowski, Durham, and Smoot. Just think of the things you may find when you're looking for something else. That is exactly how I found this story about 8 years ago when I was looking for aircraft and missions that my Uncle David Steele may have flown during World War II. Our story today is another first of firsts, one that is documented in history and rooted in legend. One that pits the desperation of an empire trying anything to subdue the tide of freedom. It is a story where our heroes in the 8th Air Force are flying daylight missions without fighter escort, making them heroes and whose names we hopefully never forget. The Steele crew and their friends are part of the first wing of the 8th Air Force and have found themselves in a struggle with combatants under the command of Nazi leader Hermann Goering and his Luftwaffe henchmen. The Steele crew and their friends are doing their best to slow the Nazi war machine, to thereby turn the tide of war and bring to an end the horrible conflict that we call World War II. The young men in our story have found themselves in deja vu attacks on Nazi infrastructure, like the submarine pens at Saint Nazaire, the marshalling yards at Rouen, and the naval base at Emden, Germany, which by the end of the war will be a city barely on the map. The missions in our story started in France, but have now moved into Germany, which is putting logistical pressure on the Luftwaffe as they try to defend a much larger geography. Let us not forget the Russians are doing their part in the east and are slowly pushing the Germans back, especially after the devastating defeat at Stalingrad. The Eastern Front was slowly developing into another epic battle, which would culminate at Kursk in just 4 months. The Eastern Front in its grand scale, the British night raids on Germany, and the American bold daylight missions are taxing Goering's Luftwaffe, which finds itself trying to defend against an ever-growing fleet of U.S. and British bombers. Out of necessity comes innovation, which is the foundation of today's story, where a Luftwaffe pilot gets creative and makes a different kind of attack on the 91st Bomb Group, which was flying just ahead of the 306th Bomb Group and Steele's 423rd Squadron. The attack is the first of its kind in an effort to knock the Boeing B-17F beauties out of the sky. Have you ever thought about how you are personally tied to history? Well, remember, you are, so don't be afraid to find your connection. Maybe you are tied to today's story. Let's hope so, because that would be cool. With that, let's get this mission off the ground. Episode 12, Bombs Away. We are going back in time to Wilhelmshaven, Germany. Wilhelmshaven is an important coastal town on the North Sea that has a nice deep harbor that the Kriegsmarine uses as a port and repair facility. The day's boycott of Jewish businesses was overseen by the brown shirt thugs. The day was supposed to be a day of honor and celebration, but instead it had started off with prejudice and hate. The soon-to-be officially named Admiral Von Scheer was a magnificent ship, creatively built within the parameters of the Treaty of Paris, which most Germans felt was unduly harsh. Here is a history lesson. When a punishment is so great, and when those conditions for peace are punitive to a point where the common citizen, man, woman, or child, is hungry, needs shelter, is cold, and has their economy crippled, well, it simply weakens one's resolve against tyranny. I'm not saying that is an excuse for acceptance, but rather a fact for debate. And if you thought 1920s and 1930s Germany was bad, well, hold on, because a much harder punishment was about to arrive. The Admiral Von Scheer was sitting on the dock at Wilhelmshaven, ready to be christened, then launched in the day's celebration by Admiral Von Scheer's daughter, Marianne. The heavy cruiser was a lightweight in the world of superpower ships, weighing in at only 10,000 tons, but it would pack a punch, carrying 6 11-inch battleship guns that would earn it the moniker Pocket Battleship. I do not know what Marianne's political affiliation or personal beliefs were, as there does not appear to be a lot of external references for her. So not knowing what she thought of the Nazis or their intentions, I will not speculate on them and rather focus on the assumption that she was proud of her father and his accomplishments. She was certain that her mother's murder impacted her father more than any combat or horrors of World War I ever did. It had been less than 5 years since his passing, and she knew her father would be pleased to have such an honor of having a magnificent ship named after him. The morning passed, the crowds gathered, the brown shirts watched, and the Kriegsmarine started a ceremony. After a speech and ramblings of politics and heroism, the Von Scheer was ready for its christening, and Marianne said a few words of thanks and smashed the champagne, I wonder if it was French, across the bow, and with that, the Von Scheer and its 609 feet of armored steel rolled into the harbor, with the Kriegsmarine band playing, the crowd clapping, the politicians patting themselves on the back with their own arms, and the Kriegsmarine officers smiling at the Von Scheer as it pitched side to side and came level in the chilly April waters of the North Sea. As we come back to present story time, March 1943, the Admiral Von Scheer pocket battleship is the target for today's mission, nearly 10 years to the day after the Admiral Von Scheer had been launched. The Meat Hound sat on the runway in Thurley, England, with her engines abuzz, and Lieutenant Steele in the left side seat. Steele had a brief thought of home, Greenville, Texas, and of his mom who had passed, and of his dad and brother. It was just a glimpse, like the mind can do, and just enough to keep the memories alive. He longed for home and for family, and he knew that his chances of seeing home again were diminishing each day this bloody war continued. Today is Steele's 9th mission, and he knew the odds of survival were stacking up against him. Lieutenant Steele blinked, and he was out of his memories and focused on Lieutenants Hopkins and Pip as they took 42-5422, a no-named F-Duty, into the sky. When one watches a B-17 throttle up, it seems like the ship is never going to get off the ground as it rumbles down the runway. This is a similar feeling when you are flying her, but you know that once you get to 100 miles per hour, she always starts to lift. And even though the takeoff may not be as classy or graceful as the aircraft deserves, she carries her weight and lumbers into flight. The Meat Hound was next in line, then it was time to go. The checklist in the startup was routine as the Meat Hound was becoming an extension of her pilots and crews. Ready? Lieutenant Steele asked. Jones confirmed. Steele announced over the interphone it was their turn, and with that the throttles were pushed forward. The boot was removed from the brake, and the Meat Hound lurched forward as the scream of her engines became deafening. The Meat Hound lifted off the tarmac and began to rumble through the air in what appeared to be a slow-motion climb that Steele and Jones pushed to the limits of stalling. Lieutenant Steele steered the Meat Hound into a soft bank with his eyes on Hopkins and Pip and the rest of the first element from the 423rd Squadron. Lieutenants Urey and Suggs were now coming up behind them in Old Faithful 42-5714, with the infamous Tech Sergeant Mike Roskovich on the wireless as they led the second element of the 423rd Squadron into position. The second element was a little different today and that it had 4 aircraft with 1 flying in the hole. After 3 more trips around the airfield, the 423rd Squadron had her aircraft in formation as the bomb group started gaining altitude and headed for their first waypoint. The 423rd Squadron was being led by Captain Smith and Lieutenant Kelly in the DFC. Lieutenants Hopkins and Pip were flying a no-named F-Beauty in the lead number 2 position, while the Meat Hound and crew were in the number 3 position of the lead element. The second element was being led by Old Faithful, with Lieutenants Johnson and Wigington in a no-named F-Beauty in the 2nd position. Lieutenants O'Hara and Smith were flying a no-named F-Beauty today and occupied the 3rd position of the 2nd element, with Lieutenants Check and Cassidy in the Skywolf filling the slot or the number 4 position, which to this point in the war or missions was not very common position, but as the planes, men, and equipment grew, so did the slot position in the formations. 46. Today was the 46th mission by the 8th Air Force on the Nazi war machine. The missions had started late last summer of 1942 and were now in the spring of 1943, and the crews who had first arrived last summer were few and far between. Even the replacements had been replaced. The 8th Air Force was in rapid growth mode, which was making the logistics of the planes, men, equipment, housing, maintenance, transportation, and food quite complex. East Anglia was filled with bases, and new ones were being built every day. The 8th Air Force was starting to add whole new bomb groups into the mix. The Grim Reapers, that is the name of the 423rd Squadron, were flying the low left position of the formation, which was known as Purple Heart Corner. If we go by name, it sounds like the Grim Reapers should be flying the Purple Heart Corner position in a formation. The Meat Hound, in her olive drab beauty and focused brow, was in a steady climb over the English Channel as Lieutenant Steele and Jones chatted back and forth. The bomb group was being led by Major McKay and Captain Smith, which left the Meat Hound's crew with a good feeling and no real complaints. The complaints were of other non-flying officers, the decline in the quality of their food, and the necessity for a hot shower. Lieutenant Steele continued to shepherd the Meat Hound with his hands covered by the heavy flying gloves, while Lieutenant Jones eyed the manifold pressure gauges and the fuel and oil pressures. Everything was in order. The chatter amongst the crew started to focus on Germany and their target. The Meat Hound's crew did not need to be reminded that they were headed into Germany. What they did not realize was that each trip into Germany was making old Hermann Göring more and more agitated. Herman's agitation was turning into rants and accusations of cowardice, which he was freely labeling on any Luftwaffe base commander who was not flying missions. This internal political pressure was compounded by the daily external pressure, both day and night, from the American and British bomber crews. Lieutenant Steele and Jones eyed the formation in front of them, while the slender Sergeant Smoot from his tailgun position provided a detailed account of where everyone was and what the formation looked like from behind. The Meat Hound and her crew were headed north by northeast on a vector towards Wilhelmshaven. Steele, Jones, Stymax, Hull, and Smoot had been to Wilhelmshaven before. In fact, they were part of the group that was first over Germany, so they were familiar with Wilhelmshaven, her docks, and her defenses. One difference from the last trip is that this time Sergeant Hull is going to get to toggle the bomb load instead of being cooped up in the ball turret gun position. The interphone chatter continued. It is amazing what one remembers when someone is shooting at you, and those memories of past missions entered into the crew's conversation, which included a few colored editorial comments as their nerves and anxiety started to mount. The pocket battleship Admiral Von Scheer had her photograph taken on March 18th while she sat at the center dock on the north side of Wilhelmshaven harbor. The British Royal Navy was certainly eager to sink the Von Scheer, but the Von Scheer had eluded them, and the British Royal Navy had been unable to catch her in open water. The German wolf packs were still dangerous, even though their reign was quickly coming to an organized death. They provided enough of a shield that allowed the Von Scheer to continue her game of Marco Polo while ending up in a safe harbor. So, what the British Royal Navy could not do, the United States Air Force decided they would try to sink the Admiral Von Scheer. Just before the Meat Hound reached altitude, Steele asked for a gun check and position status report. Let's take that opportunity to review the crew that's on the Meat Hound today. Sergeant Smoot tested his guns from the tail gun position, and the twin Brownings rat-a-tat-tat with the most satisfying of results. Sergeant Smoot reported in and also updated that the second element of the 423rd Squadron, led by Yuri, was in good order. The ball turret gunner position has to be one of the most famous and iconic positions on the B-17 aircraft. Sergeant Piotrowski was once again with Steele and Jones since fate had spared him on March 1, 1943, in the collision with the bodacious critter. Sergeant Piotrowski ripped off a successful firing of his weapons and reported in, ready for duty, sir. The waist gunners joined in concert of arms with Sergeant Durham on the left waist gun and Sergeant Stokowski, a new crew member for us, on the right waist gun. Sergeant Stokowski joined the 306th Bomb Group in February 24th and was from Illinois. Both gunners reported that everything was in order. So far, so good. It seems pretty straightforward to have guns and ammunition that worked when you needed them, but Mother Nature and the stresses of combat took their toll on the crew members and their weapons. That meant at any given time or in the middle of a defense, there was no guarantee that the gun or the crew member would be functioning at all, let alone at maximum efficiency. To make matters worse, the gunners in the 306th Bomb Group were cursing the quality of the ammunition they had been given today. Each aircraft tested their guns. The rumblings from the crews made their ways to the cockpit. "Captain, sir, we have crap ammo again." As I write these stories and research these missions, I constantly ask myself, how is it that the United States in World War II is making crap ammunition? What made matters worse was that some of the new armorers had shorted the ammunition belts. This meant some machine guns had only 25 rounds of ammunition in them, which meant that the gunner would have to change belts in the middle of any firefight, short or long. The last of the twin Browning machine guns were tested by Sergeant William Wilbur Fahrenhold from the top turret gun engineer's position, since our usual engineer, Sergeant Banforth, was either on leave or rest. Sergeant Fahrenhold would eventually become a toggler, but today he would be organizing the central defense of the Meat Hound. And we will learn more about Sergeant Fahrenhold when we get to our Medal of Honor story, which is still a little bit down the road. Yes, you heard right. The 306th 423rd Bomb Squadron has a Medal of Honor story on the horizon. The Meat Hound's nose was staffed by a couple of sergeants, one being our usual toggler, Sergeant William Hall, and the second being a new name to our story, Sergeant Bukasek, who was doing the navigating. Buka, as he was known, was from Alabama and is listed as a waist gunner in the squadron records, but today he's listed as the navigator. The mission report clearly lists Buka as a navigator and does not mark the position as a gunner, so maybe he was the navigator. We also know that Steele's good friend, Lieutenant Ormond Hamilton, has flown his last mission. Between Hamilton taking flak in the neck on his second mission and the crash of the Unbearable, Hamilton has made his last flight and will move on to start teaching the next set of replacements and navigators. How common was a sergeant navigator, I asked myself. I do not know. I can say that it is not very common, and it is difficult to find clear examples, at least on what I've found so far. Generally, the navigator was an officer's role, but maybe Buka had experience in civilian life, or had been trained, or maybe the logs were just not properly noted and there should have been a navigator on board, but that just adds to the fog of war. The nose guns were fully functioning, which leaves us with the radio operator for this mission, which is our good friend Sergeant Stymax. Sergeant Stymax was tucked in his small room separated from the crew. His station was not luxurious, and even though it was a room, it provided a false sense of security, since the armor plate protecting it was nearly non-existent. The Meat Hound continued to gain altitude and crossed 10,000 feet when her crew went on oxygen. Steele held a north by northwest bearing as the Netherlands and German barrier islands were rapidly approaching, and the whole crew knew they were about 40 minutes from Germany. Lieutenant Jones commented on the visibility, which was good. The Meat Hound's crew had some good interphone banter. They were discussing their target, the Admiral Von Scheer. Do you think we'll be able to see her? Hull, do you think you can get a good aim point on her? Look at the skies, boys. The weather is good. I am sure Sergeant Hull will drop one down her gun barrel. Won't you, Sergeant? Yes, sir. It was a healthy banter, and it helped to break up the nerves. They were flying with a couple of newbies, and it was good to keep them relaxed. Sergeant Buka chimed in with his Alabama accent. Don't worry, Sergeant. I'll hold them off you while you drop those bombs down their throats. Captain and Tail Gunner, how are we looking? Good, sir. Nothing out of order. Time passed. The flying was routine, but the waiting was hell. Lieutenant Steele and Jones were starting to get on edge, wondering when the Nazi greeting party was going to arrive. Eyes up, boys. Let's be ready. Engineer, how are we looking? Sergeant Farrenhold took a spin in his top, and the skies were clear. Captain to ball turret. How are you doing, Walt? Good, sir. Let's let him have it. The Luftwaffe radar and Y stations were abuzz as 69 B-17s and 15 B-24s lit up their screens. The large formation of bombers were easily recognized. The Nazi High Command had developed, quote, defense of the right, air groups and flak stations to ward off the Allied invaders. Now the invaders were freely flying into Germany. Let me be fair and call out that the British Royal Air Force had been flying into Germany at night since very early in the war. But the Americans and the 8th Air Force, well, they were in-your-face interlopers, the worst kind, and they were arrogant to boot. We will see how that arrogance and disregard for life would take its toll on both sides. A high-pitched shrill alerted the Luftwaffe bases at 14:24 hours that United States heavy bombers were inbound, so any prior orders were canceled, and the bombers would be the day's new priority. The squadron from JG-1 started to scramble, which meant the pilots were to get in their planes, get in the air, and destroy the invaders. Invaders sounds pretty funny, calling the Americans invaders, right? Maybe today they were more like interlopers because they were not going to stay. Steele welcomed the accusation of being an invader, and he thought to himself how nice it was to be a multiple-time offender, flying a new invader, the Meat Hound. The Meat Hound had no feelings. She simply functioned in a world of science, physics, and human intervention that included a strong religious support system that grew when she herself started to become holy. Sergeant Stymax was listening to the wireless and knew well the voice of his good friend Mike, who today was flying in Old Faithful, tucked in just behind the Meat Hound. The 306 bomb group was still a little shy of the coast, but they were closing fast. The radio silence had been broken, and the wireless chatter started, which meant somewhere up ahead the Luftwaffe had started their attacks on the lead bomb group, and the life and death struggle was afoot. The Steele crew reported no mechanical issues. Usually there was something to report, But today, there was nothing of significance so long as the ammunition was good. The Meat Hound was getting close to making her first venture into Germany. Smooth sailing meant the crew could completely focus on the bombing of Wilhelmshaven and the defense of the Meat Hound. The Meat Hound had a lovely view of the 91st Bomb Group, which was positioned just past the lead element of the 306th. Sergeant Fahrenhold from his top turret gun position was working with a clear sky, with his only obstructions being contrails and frosted windows. This young man was witnessing history unfold in front of him as both the Memphis Belle and the Liberty Belle carried the 324th Squadron of the 91st Bomb Group towards their objective, where they would soon be met by the Luftwaffe fighters and the black carpet of death, which so far into Germany was not nearly as bad as Saint Nazaire. The sergeant was not aware of the historical significance at the time, which would only be revealed later, and if he survives the war. Lieutenants Steele and Jones from the cockpit also had a magnificent view of the 324th, and they could see the Luftwaffe single-engine fighters ramping up for attacks. Lieutenant Steele called out to the crew to be alert, and he was concerned for the defense of the Meat Hound and the safety of the crew. And then the Black Death rattled the cockpit of the Meat Hound with high intensity, and she was tossed side to side. The explosion shattered hot metal shards that pierced the Meat Hound through the cockpit, which got Steele and Jones's attention. Everyone checked themselves, and Jones eyed the gauges, which indicated nothing important had been hit, while the banging of the flak intensified. I wonder what the Meat Hound was thinking. She was getting shot at and hit, so I imagine it was about this time that she was telling herself, "I am the Meat Hound. I was riveted by the best. I can fly on one engine. If the enemy looks at me in the eye, they will see my determination, the sweat on my brow, the big white teeth better to bite you with, the big wide eyes better to see you with, and my pointed ears better to hear you with. Beware, because I have found my prey, and I am in hot pursuit. I have 10 young men with me who are counting on me and me on them." I suppose that is what the Meat Hound was thinking. The Meat Hound crossed into Germany tight in formation, with her 4 Wright Patterson radial engines screaming with delight. The hunter was now being hunted, as Steele called out the enemy contrails at 12 o'clock high. "Eyes up and get ready, boys." What do you think was going through the crew's head? Will they single us out? Can we stay in formation? Can I shoot one down? There were both single and twin-engine fighters headed towards the Meat Hound, which meant old Herman was expecting the Luftwaffe to use every resource to repulse the 8th Air Force attack. Sergeant Fahrenhold was nervous, but he was central to the Meat Hound's defense, standing in the top turret gun position, which felt pretty good, until he got a good look at all those enemy fighters ramping up for their attacks. The sergeant was just a little intimidated, but he was ready. Even though the U.S. Air Corps heavy bomb groups were on an afternoon mission, the Luftwaffe pilots had been up early, flying other sorties until the heavy bombers arrived. There were no particular dogfights or actions to specifically call out, just coastal patrols and the ongoing looking for an RAF coastal command. You know, those chaps flying escort and defense services for the Royal and Allied fleets. The Luftwaffe pilots were ramping up for the attack from JG-1 based out of Jäfer, west of Wilhelmshaven. They were not the usual yellow-nosed bastards that we're accustomed to, but rather the Tatzelwurm, and would later be named after one of their famed pilots, Walter Wieso, who was killed in 1944. But for now, they were the Tatzelwurm, so I suppose to the airmen of the 306th, they were the Tatzelwurm bastards. JG-1's leader was Oberst Lieutenant Dr. Erich Mix, who was an experienced but much older pilot, and one whom old Herman had been quite critical of. I do not have clear optics into whether the Oberst Lieutenant Dr. Erich Mix flew today's mission, but in researching the day, one thing is clear, and that is old Hermann Goering's disposition as it relates to his Luftwaffe leaders at the aerodromes, and it is less than cordial. But that in itself is not telling, other than maybe Oberst Lieutenant Mix stays out of the fight when he is expected to be in the thick of it, or maybe he joins the fight to keep his boss from seeking him out for a special kind of vengeance. These are stories of Goering calling, or I should say there are stories of Goering calling the airfields to ask if the leaders were flying, and if they were not, then they were labeled as cowards, which I'm sure is worse than Santa's naughty list. I did find documentation that the Luftwaffe wing commander, the Commodore, flew today, but that is not the Oberst Lieutenant Dr. Mix. The grass landing strip at Yavor did not help the Me-109s in either takeoff or landings. The design of their undercarriage and wheelbase was prone to collapse due to its folding out design. The Luftwaffe pilots suffered many catastrophic crashes, so maybe the Me-109 was the German equivalent to the Corsair, aka the Ensign Killer. Additionally, the Me-109 wheelbases would suffer non-closure failures, which would force the pilot to return to base because flying wheels down was a great way to get killed. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke was flying an Me-109G Gustav variant, and he was supposed to be leading the second Staffel, but he had to relinquish the command to a subordinate because he needed extra outfitting done on his aircraft. The outfitting we are talking about is a 250-kilogram bomb that the crew was trying to attach to the bottom of the Gustav. You are probably saying to yourself, well, that is weird. What is a fighter doing loading a 250-kilogram bomb as it prepares to meet the invaders? I think you know where this is going when the title of the episode is Bombs Away. Lieutenant Knoke was a veteran, even though he was only 21 years of age, just like his counterparts on this day. His birthday was 2 days away, but he could not think about that. In fact, there was no guarantee he would make it to his birthday. Not only is Lieutenant Knoke integral to our story, he has actually been in the background of other stories, but he was masked, and I was not aware that he was even there. Knoke was only recently revealed to me through new research and discoveries while I was looking for something else. Lieutenant Knoke is the pilot that shoots down the B-24 Liberator, Macy, on February 26th, which was carrying famed journalist Robert Post, who was close to the other journalists in our story, the great Andy Rooney and Walter Cronkite. So you see, Lieutenant Knoke has been integral to our stories indeed. The Meat Hound shook with violent intensity. She bobbed and weaved with Steele and Jones working as a team to keep her tight and right. Steele glanced at the altimeter and then back to the formation as he was holding the Meat Hound tight. Sergeant Fahrenhold spotted the Focke-Wulf 190A, a bunch of them, ramping up speed, then watched them as they unleashed at 12 o'clock a dive attack on the 423rd Squadron. "Here they come, boys," Steele called through the interphone, and with that, everyone was on edge. "I have them, sir," Fahrenhold replied. The Meat Hound shook as the Black Death tossed her around, and the Tatzelwurm bastards were brave today, flying through their own flak and pressing home attacks on each of the squadrons and each of the bomb groups. The 423rd Squadron, in concert, erupted with a defensive fire as the cohort of B-17s tried to evade with bobs and weaves. "Steele the bombardier, we are getting close." Everyone in the front of the aircraft was watching for the flare. Everyone was waiting for the flare, except, of course, for the Luftwaffe. They were crashing the party. The Meat Hound's 50 caliber machine guns rang out with the distinguished rat-a-tat-tat-tat. That was playing the Symphony of Defense. The pouncing of the Luftwaffe Focke-Wulf 190As provided Steele with an opportunity to reflect on the BS propaganda that he and the other flyers were fed in training. The BS that was served up was that the Luftwaffe would attack the B-17s in their most fortified of positions, and just like that, the Luftwaffe came screaming through the formation, generating the most horrific sounds of war. Major Mac McKay was leading the 306th Bomb Group in their pursuit of the Von Scheer as she laid moored in Wilhelmshaven. Major McKay was an original member of the Bomb Group, trusted and respected, and seemed to only talk to God when he was in a tight spot. His aircraft was Captain Heavy, so losing her would be a blow to the bomb group. Captain Reagan was co-piloting, or maybe actually flying the plane, as McKay was the leader on the mission today. So even though he is leading the mission, it does not mean he is flying. In fact, there is a good chance he's in the co-pilot seat, directing the day's activities and helping Reagan fly the aircraft. The navigator was Captain Selitnik, along with Bomb Group Bombardier Captain Yalsey. All of this brass was in 24498 Dark Horse, a B-17F variant. Losing the Dark Horse would certainly give the bomb group a black eye, so let's hope that does not happen. The Dark Horse crew was a very experienced, and it wasn't the first time Captain Yalsey was trying to bomb Wilhelmshaven. They could see the Luftwaffe begin their attacks on the 91st Bomb Group, and they knew they were next. Captain Reagan could see the Yankee Raider out his right window being flown by Lieutenant Robert Miller and 2nd Lieutenant John Tier, who had come in on March 12th. The Eager Beaver 24487 was being thrown around by flak as they were positioned in the third slot of the lead element. She was being piloted by Lieutenants Lally and Judas. Lieutenant Arrieta, from his bombardier position, could see the Nazi ground smoke screen starting to form up as the Black Death crashed around the Eager Beaver. Lieutenant Arrieta flinched as the flak crashed through the No. 2 engine, while Lieutenant Lally could see the engine and the ailerons had taken damage, but it did not appear to be severe, and the engine performance was still up to par. Lieutenants Lally and Judas were watching the stragglers out of the lead groups start to fall behind, and they knew that meant trouble for those planes and crews. Then, with a flash and a scream, a Focke-Wulf 190 cuts through the 306th Bomb Group just as they were getting ready to start their bomb run on Wilhelmshaven. The guns from several B-17s greeted the Focke-Wulf 190 as it hammered the B-17s with its 20mm cannons, and the B-17s hammered back with their Browning 50 calibers. Lieutenant Daniels was on the bomb sights of the Grim Reaper 41-24-467 when the plexiglass of the nose of the ship shattered, wounding Lieutenant Daniels and knocking him backwards. At the same time, Lieutenants Reber and Peterson from the cockpit were startled as the instrument panel of the Grim Reaper was shot out. Sparks flew everywhere, smoke started to fill the cockpit, and the aircraft was in peril. Lieutenants Reber and Peterson barely had time to assess the damage when Lieutenant Bergen called in on the interphone to say that Lieutenant Daniels had been hit and the nose of the aircraft had a 6-inch hole in it. Come to find out, it appears that the damage had been inflicted by the Eager Beaver. This was a case of friendly fire where the Focke-Wulf 190 had caused the Eager Beaver in her defense to hit the Grim Reaper as the Focke-Wulf 190 had cut through the formation. Lieutenant Daniels was going to be okay, and the crew got things sorted out. Lieutenant Berger got Lieutenant Daniels hand wrapped and bandaged, Then he tried to plug the hole in the nose while Lieutenant Daniels scurried back to the bomb site. The Admiral Von Scheer was fast approaching. Captain Yelsey, the bomb group bombardier, had the controls of the Dark Horse, which was flying level and straight. The bomb bay doors were open, and Yelsey had a clear view of the Admiral Von Scheer, since the harbor smokescreen was ineffective, and it had been too late to have any effect. Bombs away, and the 5 1,000-pound bombs headed for the harbor. Major McKay took back the controls just as the next Luftwaffe attack started to commence. Lieutenants Steele and Jones maintained a soft but firm grip on the Meat Hound's wheel as the bomb group started their no-evasive actions through the bomb run. Sergeant Hull was toggling, which meant he would release the Meat Hound's 5 1,000-pound bombs when Captain Yelsey and the Dark Horse released theirs. The wait was excruciating. It never felt like the time would come. Sergeants Farrenhold, Piotrowski, Durham, Stokowski, Buka, and Smoot were all at battle stations, waiting for an attack that would come shortly. Then, there they went, the bombs out of the Dark Horse, and Sergeant Hull released the Meat Hound's fury. Sergeant Hull watched as the 5 drab green monsters of death glided peacefully towards the harbor in concert with the rest of the bomb group. Meanwhile, Sergeant Roskovich had climbed out of his radio room with his dummy bomb and threw it out the bomb bay door while the waist gunners McClure and Trenery encouraged him. Maybe it would hit some squarehead in the noggin, then take the Luftwaffe bomb squad 3 days to figure it out. It was a dummy bomb. Practice bomb. Sergeant Hull watched as the Meat Hound's peacemakers crashed into what was believed to be a residential district, and Sergeant Hull was greatly disappointed. He would not get credit for destroying the Von Scheer. A huge red fireball erupted, and thick black smoke started to darken the harbor district, screening the bombers way better than the intentional smoke screen. The bombing results for the bomb group in general was a great disappointment. Captain Yelsey was short, Lieutenant Brunig was short, Lieutenant John Brown hit the city's center. Lieutenant Lenkovich was left of the target. Staff Sergeant McDonald and Giesel were northwest of the Von Scheer. Lieutenant Hickey was short. C.J. Travis was short in the Connecticut Yankee. The disappointment continued with Lieutenant Lindsay and Dixie Demo, but he did not win the pin the tail on the donkey contest when some of his bombs, he did win the pin the tail on the donkey contest when some of his bombs hit the docks. The Von Scheer had eluded the 306 bomb group, so it was time for Major McKay to get them out of town. Major McKay banked left and led the bomb group out of the harbor district with thick black smoke billowing from the city. The flak was constant, and then came the Luftwaffe with another attack. Major McKay and Captain Regan could see the Tatzelworm bastards aligning for an attack, and in an instant, both sides erupted gun and cannon fire, with tracers flashing through the air and 20mm cannon shells exploding as the gaggle of Nazi aircraft came flying through the bomb group. Steele was bobbing and weaving in a tight formation, following in concert with the DFC. Regular bobs and weaves, not those thatch weaves that the Spitfires would employ. The top turret guns of the 423rd erupted as Sergeants Farrenhold, Harrison, and Bizak tried to knock out the attacking assailants. The waist gunners and ball turret gunners picked up the white bastards as they flew by, and Steele could see parts and pieces flying off of both sides as the blows were exchanged. Lieutenant Flowers and Sergeant Melio from the nose of the no-named F-Beauty 422 acquired a Focke-Wulf 190 at 800 yards and laid into her with their Browning machine guns. The Tatzelworm pilot was doomed as the 50 caliber rounds were seen entering the cockpit, and the Focke-Wulf 190 rolled over, burst into flames, and screamed for the earth. One soul lost. Here they come again. I wonder how many times the pilots and crews shouted this verbiage in World War II. Our photogenic friend Sergeant Lusick, from his right waist gun position of the no-named F-Beauty 422, tries to take out the Focke-Wulf 190 headed for Johnson and Wigington in 171, another named F-Beauty, when Sergeant Raymond Henn joins the defense from his right waist gun position. The Focke-Wulf 190 unleashed a deadly barrage of cannon fire, and Sergeant Henn returned the favor with his Browning machine gun. The no-named F-Beauty 171 shook as the side of the aircraft was decimated with cannon fire, as Sergeant Henn unleashed his fury as the Focke-Wulf was delivering hers. The no-named F-Beauty took several punches to the midsection by the Focke-Wulf's 20mm cannons, which resulted in explosions throughout the aircraft. Sergeant Powell on the left waist gun was hit by flying shrapnel and went down. He was calling for help as the right waist gun fell silent. Sergeant Bean came through the melee from his radio room to provide assistance, but there was nothing he could do for Sergeant Henn. Poor Sergeant Henn. It was horrible. Blood was everywhere. Sergeant Bean was sickened by the scene. Sergeant Henn had been hit in the face by a 20mm shell as he stood toe-to-toe with the Tatzelwurm attacker. Is there any consolation to a quick death? I suppose, indeed, but it is still sad nonetheless. Sergeant Raymond Henn from Long Island, New York, was brave without a fault, and even though the mission reports do not credit Sergeant Henn with downing his killer, Russell Strong awards him that victory in the 306 Bomb Group unit history. Sergeant Bean was able to get Sergeant Powell stable as the frigid air helped to slow the blood loss, but they all knew when they dropped altitude the bleeding would intensify. There was no rest for the weary as the Luftwaffe came in from 3 o'clock high on the high squadron, looking to cut through the bomb group and hit both the high and low squadrons. The Focke-Wulfs in all white paint schemes started their attack. Howard and Holstrom took the squadron into evasive maneuvers. Hennessy and Littlejohn and Little Audrey were used to these kind of maneuvers, but it didn't mean that they liked it. The Old Faithful's guns erupted as Lieutenant Haynes took her into the mini roller coaster ride. These white Focke-Wulfs had surprised the squadron and were within 150 yards, closing at 350 miles an hour, when Sergeant Frank Latto from his right waist gun position squeezed the handles with his thick gloves, and the Browning machine gun was on fire, and the ammo was good enough, piercing the cowling and cockpit of the white Focke-Wulf. The enemy fighter immediately nosed down and made her way to the water, leaving a trail of smoke as she did, then crashed into the frigid water of the North Sea. One soul lost. Nice shooting, Sergeant. You got one, Frank, said Sergeant Romo. You showed that bastard, Frank. Did you see him nose over, Frank? Nice shooting. Back on the Meat Hound, Lieutenant Steele asked for a report, and the Meat Hound crew reported in. They had taken minor damage in the latest attack, but there was no technical issues or concerns, and that was good, because on this day, they were going to be chased all the way home. It's time to weave Lieutenant Heinz Knoke of JG-1 back into the story. He was finally airborne in his overweight Me-109 Gustav, which was slow to gain altitude, and he thought he would never get into the fight. Not only did it take longer than expected to get the 250-kilogram bomb fitted to his fuselage, but he needed to take off into the wind so his Gustav could get more lift, and while he was taxiing to the far side of the runway, he blew a tire. Lieutenant Knoke was stuck on the runway, and his frustration was mounting, and he was afraid he was going to lose his opportunity. Lieutenant Knoke opened the cockpit, fired a red flare to alert the ground crew that he needed help. His ground crew witnessed the flare and knew what was wrong. A gaggle of Luftwaffe ground crew members jumped into a truck and rushed to Knoker's aid. His ground crew was extremely skilled, and they changed the wheel by lifting the plane on their shoulders while the Gustav engine was still running. I suppose there are feats of courage on both sides of this war, and this feat of courage will have an impact on today's story. The wheel was quickly changed. Knoker revved the engine and bounced down the runway, slowly gaining the slightest of altitude. The ground crew watched, yelling for Knoker to get off the ground. Knoker was max throttling, trying to get everything out of the engine. Some of the ground crew could not watch, thinking that they were about to lose another experienced pilot and a good friend. The Me-109 Gustav aircraft did not have the best wheelbase, and crashes were common, and the ground crew knew the extra weight was a death knell. Lieutenant Knoker was hard on the flaps as he skimmed over one of the hangars. He did it, and the crew cheered. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke was now in hot pursuit, and he could see that Wilhelmshaven had been bombed, and he knew the American forts were headed for home. His aircraft was sluggish and slow to respond. His head was on a swivel, and if any Allied fighters appeared, he would be a sitting duck. But it's still early in the war, and these U.S. bomb groups were making raids with less than 100 forts and no air support into the teeth of the enemy, who still had a large number of experienced pilots to engage the Americans. So I hope that does not bode badly for the Meat Hound. The Meat Hound knew they were going to have a running fight home. Sergeant Smoot was on the interphone letting them know he could see the contrails and they were being chased. The Meat Hound was bobbing, weaving, while she waited for the next shoe to drop. The Meat Hound had her nose-art, bloodshot eyes fixed on the sad sack, a no-name deaf beauty, Connecticut Yankee, Ritzy Blitz, Liberty Bell, and the soon-to-be famous Memphis Belle ahead of her. They were the next bomb group forward. The 324th Bomb Squadron was being led by Captain McClellan, the 324th Operations Officer, flying Liberty Bell, and he was flying with a mixed crew from the 92nd Bomb Group, which is just another example of the piecing and patching that was done just to get the maximum effort into the air. Most of the crews in both the 324th and 423rd Squadrons could see a Me-109 flying above the bomb group's position, about 1,000 meters above and 600 meters ahead of the 91st Bomb Group. There was no concealment of the Me-109G. She was flying wing dip left, wing dip right, and with no other evasive action. The 91st Bomb Group opened fire on the Me-109G with their top turret gunners, who were adamant they would bring her down. Sergeant Sam Williams opened up fire from his twin 50 caliber top turret guns, and even though the Me-109G was at distance, the 50 caliber had the range, and Williams was pouring it on. Sergeant Fahrenhold had a good look at the Me-109G, but she was just too far away. Lieutenant Heinz Knoke was at 30,000 feet. He dipped his wing left and he saw the lead bomb group. He hit soft rudder and slipped a little left, then dipped right wing to see how he looked. He then looked back to the left and noticed the sunlight coming through his wings. The fortresses were hitting him. He made a quick look around to check for enemy fighters, but there were none. Lieutenant Knoke wondered if the tactic he and Lieutenant Dieter Gerhard had devised would work on something other than test planes. He set the 250 kilogram bomb on a 15-second fuse, and then he released his bomb. Yes, bomb. He was going to bomb the bombers. If only Dieter had made it to this day to witness the results. But alas, poor Lieutenant Gerhard had been killed days earlier by the same bomb group crews who were on the mission today. The bomb was away, and Knoke watched and waited. Steele was hoping the 91st Bomb Group would kick it into turbo drive, but the fact was, a steady, tight formation was the best defense because these behemoths were not going to outrun anything. Engineer to captain, engineer to captain. Tech Sergeant saw Wiki and Chex and Cassidy's Skywolf, the aircraft Jones and Steele had not had good luck in. Yes, Sergeant, that enemy aircraft just dropped something reddish in color from its fuselage. The time was 15:15 hours. Liberty Bell, 42-29-659. Tech Sergeant Samuel L. Williams from Arkansas had Knoke in his sights, and he was trying to get the right deflection to knock him down. He saw the bomb released from the aircraft and wondered what was going on. Captain Haskell McClellan answered, "That enemy aircraft just dropped something from its fuselage. Thank you, Sergeant. Heads up, everyone." 15 seconds of combat is a lifetime or an eternity, depending on the outcome. Lieutenant Knoke's bomb exploded in the 91st Bomb Group, and the shock waves pulsated through the group. The Liberty Bell went into a tight spin, and the centrifugal force pinned the entire crew to their positions, and they could see their wing floating down like a feather in a gentle glide. The Liberty Bell was doomed, and her fate had been sealed. The Memphis Belle, Connecticut Yankee, Ritzy Blitz, Sad Sack, and the no-named F-Beauty scattered like fish in the water, only to immediately come back together for their own protection. The bomb groups continued for home. The twin-engine fighters had started their pursuit, and the loss of the Liberty Bell was barely noticed. As odd as that sounds, B-17s and other aircraft exploded, fell apart in almost every mission. One not expecting a bomb and only seeing an explosion, then an aircraft spinning out of control, was not uncommon, even though what Lieutenant Knoke had just done was quite unique. The American bomb group crews were focused on their defense, and the pilots were focused on getting home and not colliding. Steele was on the Meat Hound's controls, and she was responding favorably. They came through the debris field. Jones was making minor adjustments to the controls, and Sergeant Stokowski from his right waist gun could see the twin-engine fighters and their contrails forming up at 3 o'clock high. There was no other conversation about the large explosion that they had just witnessed, because the crew had to defend the Meat Hound. The enemy fighters had not worked their way to the nose of the formation, and they seemed to be content to attack from the rear. Maybe because it was a long chase across the channel, or maybe they were afraid to fly ahead and run into fighter protection as they made their way over the channel. Either way, they were going to attempt to cut off the head by attacking from the rear. Lieutenant Knoke and the American bomb groups were 20 miles west of the German island of Heligoland. As he watched the Liberty Bell spin into the ocean, there was no fire or explosions on board as she fell. She was clearly stricken by the concussion of the blast. Knoke returned to his base at Yavor without further incident or attack. What he had just done was a first in aviation history, and he would get the fat man's attention, just like he had the attention of the 423rd Bomb Squadron and the Meat Hound. The Meat Hound, like the other B-17s, was equipped with a supercharger on each of the Wright R-1820-97 Cyclone engines, which helped with performance at high altitude. The turbochargers were functioning well today, and as you've heard in this series, that is not always the case. Lieutenant Steele and Jones were getting the right mixture of fuel and air to keep everything running smooth, which was good because Jerry obviously had a few tricks up their sleeves, as we just heard. It was still a long chase home. They were going through many maneuvers, and the twin-engine fighters were going to pursue them all the way home. The performance of the B-17 Wright Cyclone engines were quite remarkable. It was a big plane with a lot of weight, and a single engine could bring a plane home. But flying on a single engine meant you fell out of formation and were quickly taken down by the Lions. Steele and Jones were comfortable in the pilot's seats, and the breadth of controls were well memorized. For example, they were eyeing the Meat Hound's manifold pressure, which was measured in inches. Manifold pressure is an indicator of engine power. It is the measure of how much air and fuel are getting to the cylinder heads. The Meat Hound was equipped with a Hamilton standard constant speed propeller, which helped to maintain propeller rotation as altitude and atmospheric changes occurred. In fact, the F model B-17 was the fastest of the models. The propeller controls also allowed the term we've been using in this series called feathering, where the prop blades could be turned so they would cut through the air, thereby reducing drag when the engine was no longer operable. Add in the turbochargers, which helped to add manifold pressure at high altitudes when the air pressure was less, and we have ourselves a pretty advanced aircraft. And we are talking about an aircraft designed nearly 100 years ago that is equipped with advanced scientific technology and advancements that are still the foundations of flight and engines today. The twin-engine enemy aircrafts were chasing the squadron all the way back to England. So where is the fighter support once the bomb groups got back over the channel? This does not make any sense to me. Generally, a crew or two make a comment about the lack of fighter support, but there are no such comments today. So maybe they were not expecting any, but why would one not expect fighter support? The only way not to expect fighter support is that because you were told you would not have any fighter support. By reading the pilot and crew's comments, I am convinced they were told they would have no fighter support. This gives me even more respect for these young men. They knew they would have no support over the English Channel, the North Sea, into Germany, then out of Germany, the North Sea, and the English Channel. There was not even one comment that said fighter support would have been nice, or next time, can we get fighter support? I have to say, I think this is the pinnacle of the Meat Hound series from a story perspective. We are reviewing 8th Air Force missions from late 1942 into the first part of 1943, where missions were made up, again, of less than 100 aircraft, and most of their missions were over enemy territory, where their only defense was the guy next to you. Really quite remarkable and really quite courageous. Remember, the elements would kill you faster than an enemy bullet. Okay, back to our story. Just like the Bf-109 Gustav that Heinz Knoke had just used to drop a bomb on the 91st Bomb Group, rattling the windscreen of the Memphis Belle and downing the Liberty Belle, the Bf-110 was built by Messerschmitt. The Bf-110 was a twin-engine, multi-versatile enemy fighter with a crew of 2 and could fly nearly 350 miles an hour. The aircraft was well equipped with 2 20mm MG-151 cannons and 4 7.92 MG-17s, all forward-firing weapons stacked in the nose. The gray-backed Bf-110s were gaining on the 306 Bomb Group and waiting for a chance to pounce when Lefty could not take it anymore and threw down the throttle to ramp up speed and make an attack across the trailing aircrafts of the 369th and 423rd Squadrons. Lefty and his Bf-110 focused on Hopkins and Pip and their no-named F-Beauty, flying to the Meat Hound's right. Lefty's attack would come from 4 o'clock level and come across the whole rear of the squadron. Our friend, Sergeant Lusick, who was quite busy today in the right waist gun position of Hopkins' no-named F-Beauty, began firing on the Gray Ghost as she screamed towards the 423rd Squadron. The Nazi pilot told his radio operator to hold on and keep his eyes up. They were making an attack. Whatever the German version of tally-ho is, I'm sure it was spoken. Sergeant Lusick was not the only gunner to open fire on the Gray Ghost as the Bf-110 put herself in quite the gauntlet that she was running. Johnson and Wigington in 42-51-71, right waist gunner Sergeant Raymond Henn had been killed earlier in the mission, and their right side had been badly shot up, so they were out of this defense. Oh, if the Nazi pilot had just picked on a different plane, maybe the outcome would have been different, but probably not. The Skywolf flying the slot in the 423rd Second Element with the beloved Lieutenant Czech piloting, and whose crew clearly documented Lieutenant Heinz Knoke's earlier bombing attack, joined in the defense was Staff Sergeant James Bobbitt, who had just received his first Air Medal in February at the same time as Steele, Jones, and our good friend Lieutenant Robert Malin, along with Sergeants Bamforth, Piotrowski, Smoot, and Stymax. So why do I call this out? Because these crews knew each other, and they had already been through some tough missions. Staff Sergeant Bobbitt was on the interphone calling out the attack. 110, 3 o'clock level. The angle of attack was different for the Skywolf, and as Staff Sergeant Bobbitt squeezed the lever, the .50 caliber Browning erupted in concert with her distinctive rat-a-tat-tat. Sergeant Chenlin, a tail gunner from Illinois, had a very nice view of the attack and called it out over the interphone to the rest of the crew on 423034, a no-named F-Beauty, being flown by Lieutenants Janikowski and Scheele. Sergeant Chenlin squeezed the lever and the twin Browning tail guns erupted in concert. Flying next to him in the second slot was co-tail gunner Sergeant Elwood Brotzman from Pennsylvania. He had the same routine. He called it out on the interphone to Lieutenant Reber and the crew of 4124467, the Grim Reaper, and squeezed the lever of the twin Browning machine guns as the Grim Reaper was providing defense for the Grim Reaper squadron. There sure is a lot of death in the air. This action was nearly the same for all of the tail gunners or ball turret gunners in the high squadron as the ME-110 made her dash through the gauntlet. The ME-110 was well within 200 yards, and her deadly munitions were crossing through the 423rd Squadron as Sergeant Lusick and the others were getting desperate. And just like that, the ME-110 nosed down, never to level again, and crashed into the sea, losing 2 souls. The cockpit had been riddled with .50 caliber gunfire, and the pilot simply slumped over his controls. The Luftwaffe were not done, and another ME-110 got the courage and came after the 306th. In Lieutenant Heinz Knoke's diary, he speaks of how the Luftwaffe pilots wanted to shoot down the lead aircraft of the bomb group. They knew the leader of the group, or at least the leader of the day, would be in that aircraft. The Germans in their military hierarchy were very particular about leadership and officers. This hierarchy and structure caused many issues when leaders were killed or incapacitated. Maybe that hierarchy provided a false sense of urgency to try and knock down the lead aircraft, or maybe it was just an ego thing or bravado. No matter the reason, today a final attack was launched on the 306 Bomb Group in an attempt to bring down the Captain Heavy aircraft of Major McKay. The bomb group had fallen below 15,000 feet. It was 1600 hours, and they were just over the North Sea, which again begs the question, where was the fighter support? A Messerschmitt Bf-110 with its twin engine and heavy armament was determined to take out Major McKay. The gray Messerschmitt was just under the bomb group and was in full throttle pursuit from 7 o'clock low. The 423rd Squadron from their low position were the first to pick up the gray ghost bastard, and the right waist gunners once again opened up, getting a very quick burst as she came screaming by. Sergeant Bobbitt got a burst off, as did Lieutenant Lusick and Sergeant Babs, who had come in on Lieutenant Pip's crew. Staff Sergeant August Krychek was the tail gunner in the Dark Horse. He yelled out over the interphone, ME-110, 7 o'clock, and the exchange started, and once again the pilots bobbed and weaved, and Staff Sergeant Krychek started to send a gaggle of his twin .50 caliber machine gun rounds toward the charging enemy aircraft. There was no normal burst, This was an extensive exchange as the Me-110 was throwing 20mm shells at the Dark Horse. The right engine was hit, the right engine of the Me-10, that is, and it burst into flames. Just as Staff Sergeant Krychek's extended burst was seen entering the fuselage of the Gray Ghost, and she, like the others, nose down, smoking a thick black smoke. The Meat Hound and Steele could see her headed for the water, and Sergeant Piotrowski watched her crash into the sea with a blessing and a good ridding. The last 2 attacks on the squadron had cost the Luftwaffe 2 more aircraft and 4 crew members. They had had enough as the 306 crossed into England. Steele and Jones kept the Meat Hound tight in formation, and the cloud cover made for some always anxious moments as they continued to drop altitude. Finally, Thurley was in sight. Sergeant Piotrowski had come out of the ball turret, and he had brought the Sperry turret into landing position. The Meat Hound would not get priority to land as she did not need it, but there were others that did. Lieutenant Haynes and Winters in 41-24-417 Dixie Demo set off a flare since Radio Man Staff Sergeant Fred Larmer was lying in a pool of blood from a leg wound. Lieutenants Reber and Peterson set off a flare for Lieutenant Daniels, who had been hit by friendly fire. The 423rd Squadron flying Purple Heart Corner was going to need Doc Schuler and his crew today. Johnson and Wigington were coming in with Staff Sergeant Hinn, but it was too late for him. O'Hara and Smith had a waist gunner, Sergeant Garris, with a frozen face, and he was going to find his way into the hospital. Dr. Schuler makes a note in his diary that Sergeant Hinn had been the first death that they had carried away in 3 months. Sad indeed. Steele patted the Meat Hound on the side just like you do a fine horse after a hard ride. He walked the perimeter and assessed her damage. She had taken a machine gun bullet to the left wing and a black hole in the cockpit and another one in the radio room. All in all, they were lucky. The crew was in good order and the Meat Hound would fly again. When Steele got to the briefing room, he listened in as Lieutenant Check and Cassidy and crew told their fantastical story of the Me-109 that dropped a bomb on the 91st Bomb Group. S2 Officer Skalak did not know what to write or how to report this, but he captured the episode and did not hesitate to report this up the food chain with the announcement that no crew had ever reported anything like this before. Oh wait, there will be others. The document, which is the base of this story, would be declassified in 1991, which really does not seem that long ago, does it? Heinz Knoke would survive the war, and his diary would be published for posterity. Other pilots and crews in our story will not be that lucky. The 423rd Bomb Squadron clearly witnessed the events of the day and documented Lieutenant Knoke's attack. I am thankful for that, and I am thankful that I found it. What the 91st Bomb Group saw, reported, or shared in their debriefings either does not exist or are locked up in their archives or are not available for me to see. I am hoping they come to the surface, as I would love to read more about what they saw. As I mentioned, I first saw the reference to this story several years ago when I was first given access to the 306th Bomb Group's missions. I was familiar with the Luftwaffe practice of trying to bomb bombers and the lore that was associated with it. The fact is, the German Luftwaffe was open to any idea and collected ideas from the general population on how to destroy the enemy bombers. The German Luftwaffe had an extensive research, development, and testing facility where ideation was vetted, but very few would ever see combat. However, what we do hear about in our stories are the black carpets of death. The German Luftwaffe flak guns, primarily the 88mm cannon. Flak will destroy more B-17s than the fighters and other methods combined. Our stories talk about the Luftwaffe's excellent aircraft, like the Me-109 Gustav or the Focke-Wulf 190A Butcherbird, and how they are making head-on attacks, no matter what the U.S. Army's propagandists are saying, and how their 20mm cannons can tear a B-17 apart. We talk about how the Luftwaffe sits and waits for the American fighter escort to head for home and then pounce on the B-17s. We hear about the German intelligence networks that early in the war were able to secure details of daily missions. We hear about the German radar stations, which are able to pinpoint the large formations of B-17s as they head for their targets. The Germans were rarely surprised. All of these are the creative ways that the Luftwaffe used to destroy the B-17s and their crews. All of these were the obstacles that the Meat Hound was up against. As for the pocket battleship Von Scheer, not only would she survive the day, but she would survive 2 more years of war before 300 bombers from the Royal Air Force would catch and sink her while she was moored at Kiel. So in the end, the RAF had the last laugh, and the Royal Navy had to tip their hats. As for Sergeant Raymond Henn, he would be the first 306 bomb group crew member taken away from the bomb group in the last 3 months. Others had been killed during this time, like Uncle Bill Warner, but they simply did not make it back to base. So why does Dr. Schuller make this specific comment? Because when there was no body, then there was always hope. I worry about what the proper recognition is for the Sergeant Raymond Henns and the Lieutenant Uncle Bill Warners should be. At a minimum, it is a recognition of their existence, of their courage, and of their last full measure of devotion. Hopefully, their names provide a small renaissance of remembrance and gratitude. Our next mission is scheduled for March 28, 1943, which has a little controversy attached to it and a bit of foggy wartime documentation as it relates to whether or not Lieutenant Steele is flying. We will then follow up with the April 4th, 1943 mission to Paris, where Steele will fly the Meat Hound and Sergeant Bamforth will be back in his engineer's position, quarterbacking the defense. Until the next time, just think of the things you can find when you're looking for something else. Gaspar, out.